London, late November 1826. 2 o'clock in the morning. A thick, freezing fog hangs low over St. Peter's Churchyard. The city is dead silent, save for the distant clatter of a night watchman's wooden rattle 3 streets away. Inside the iron gates of the cemetery, 2 men crouch in the mud beside a fresh grave. They do not carry lanterns, they do not speak, and notably, they do not use iron shovels. Their spades are carved entirely from heavy boxwood. Metal striking a buried stone creates a sharp, ringing sound that can carry for blocks, a sound that could get a man beaten to death by an angry mob. They do not dig up the entire grave. That would take hours. Instead, they dig a narrow, vertical shaft straight down over the head end of the coffin. 6 feet down, the spade hits wood. One of the men drops into the hole with a short, heavy crowbar. He slips the iron hook under the head of the pine lid and wrenches upward. The weight of 6 feet of packed earth resting on the lower half of the coffin acts as a natural fulcrum. With a muffled, sickening crack, the top board snaps open. The man reaches into the pitch-black box, slips a canvas rope under the armpits of a young woman who died 2 days prior, and pulls. Slowly, the cold, rigid body is hauled up into the damp night air. On the grass above, they do something unexpected. They carefully unwrap her white cotton shroud and drop it back into the hole. They strip her completely naked. They bundle her bare, frozen corpse into a coarse canvas sack, tie the top with twine, and shove it into the back of a waiting bread cart. Then, using their wooden spades, they shovel the dirt back into the hole, smooth out the surface, and scatter fallen leaves over the mud. The entire operation, from the first shovel strike to the cart driving away, takes less than 16 minutes. Why did they leave the shroud behind? Because under English law in 1826, stealing a piece of cloth, a ring, or a wooden coffin was grand larceny, a severe felony punishable by hard labor, public flogging, or 7 years in a penal colony in Australia. But stealing a naked human corpse? In the eyes of the law, a dead body belonged to no one. It was not legal property. Taking it was a mere misdemeanor, punishable only by a small fine or a few weeks in a local jail. These 2 men were not cultists. They were not rogue thieves looking for buried gold. They were salaried contract workers funded directly by the most prestigious medical schools in Western Europe. The visionary doctors, world-renowned surgeons, and brilliant professors who taught at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Edinburgh were bankrolling an underground criminal empire. Without these muddy canvas sacks, modern medicine could not advance. Without these men, every surgeon operating on a living patient was essentially operating blind. Yet as the demand for dead bodies skyrocketed across the Western world, the graveyards could no longer keep up. And when the earth ran dry, the industry faced a terrifying, inevitable escalation. What happens when the men who dig up the dead decide it is far easier to create them? In the early 19th century, medicine was undergoing a radical, bloody revolution. For centuries, doctors had treated illnesses with mystical theories, astrology, and violent bloodletting. But a new generation of scientists realized a fundamental truth. If you wanted to cure the living body, you had to understand the dead one. Surgeons needed to practice incisions. Anatomists needed to trace microscopic nerves. Students needed to understand how tumors grew, how arteries branched, and where major organs sat inside the human frame. This created a bizarre and hypocritical social crisis. Society demanded better doctors. People wanted higher survival rates from surgeries, better treatments for battlefield trauma, and an end to rampant infectious diseases. Yet that same society viewed the touching, cutting, or disassembling of a deceased human being as a dark, sacrilegious act that damned the soul to hell. When an ordinary person died, their family paid for a Christian burial in consecrated ground, trusting that their loved one would rest peacefully until the resurrection. But just outside the churchyard walls, a quiet, ruthless bidding war was taking place. A fresh adult corpse in 1820s London could fetch anywhere from 8 to 14 guineas. To put that in perspective, 8 guineas was more than a skilled factory laborer or farm worker earned in 3 full months. This was not an isolated British anomaly. In New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Edinburgh, and Paris, anatomy professors maintained secret ledgers. They listed payments made to men known in street slang as resurrectionists or resurrection men. To the public, these men were human ghouls, monsters who violated the sacred memory of mothers, fathers, and children. But to the medical elite, they were an essential public utility. Sir Astley Cooper, the premier surgeon of Guy's Hospital in London, famously testified before a parliamentary committee that the trade was completely unstoppable. Yet beneath this dark economy lay a deeply disturbing social dynamic. The resurrection trade did not affect all dead equally. The wealthy could afford deep stone vaults, reinforced granite slabs, or heavy iron coffins that no spade could penetrate. But the working poor, the destitute, and the immigrant families were buried in shallow communal pauper pits. These large trenches were left open to the elements for weeks at a time until they were filled with dozens of pine boxes. For a resurrectionist, a pauper pit was an open buffet. This meant that if you were poor, your body belonged to your family only while your heart was still beating. The moment you died, your flesh became raw material for wealthy university students to slice apart for practice. Public anger boiled under the surface for decades. Riots broke out in city streets, and grief-stricken families began arming themselves to guard fresh graves. Yet local authorities almost always turned a blind eye. The judges, police commissioners, and politicians depended on the very same surgeons who bought the stolen bodies. Still, one crucial question remained unanswered. How did a civilization that prided itself on enlightenment, religion, and order allow its medical industry to become hopelessly dependent on grave robbing in the first place? To understand why the resurrection trade exploded, you have to look back to a single catastrophic mistake that halted medical science for 1,500 years. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman physician Galen wrote the definitive textbooks on human anatomy. Galen was a brilliant scientist, but he worked under a severe constraint. Roman law strictly forbade the dissection of human corpses. To bypass this law, Galen dissected what he had available: pigs, goats, dogs, and Barbary macaques. He assumed that animal interiors were identical to human interiors. For the next 15 centuries, European medicine treated Galen's writings as absolute divine truth. Medical students sat in grand lecture halls while a professor read Galen's Latin texts from a high podium. No one ever touched a body. Because of this, for over 1,000 years, doctors believed that the human liver had 5 distinct lobes, that the uterus was two-pronged like a dog's, that blood sloshed back and forth through invisible pores in the heart, and that the jawbone was made of 2 separate pieces. None of this was true. It was not until 1543, when the Flemish physician Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, that the medical world experienced a violent wake-up call. Vesalius stole the corpses of executed criminals from gibbets, dissected real human bodies, and proved that Galen had made hundreds of critical errors. Vesalius proved a simple, revolutionary rule: human medicine requires human study. By the mid-1700s, medical education shifted dramatically. Universities adopted the Paris method and the Edinburgh model. Medical lectures were no longer enough. Every single student was now required to personally dissect a corpse, cutting through layers of skin, muscle, fat, and bone to pass their surgical licensing exams. Then, the British Parliament stepped in with a law that accidentally triggered a 100-year crisis, the Murder Act of 1752. Parliament wanted to add a terrifying new terror to the death penalty. They decreed that the bodies of executed murderers would never receive a Christian burial. Instead, their corpses would be handed directly over to anatomists to be publicly dissected and dismantled. In the eyes of 18th century society, dissection was viewed as a punishment worse than hanging. It was total physical annihilation, depriving the deceased of a complete body on the day of divine judgment. This created a mathematical disaster. In the late 1700s, Great Britain executed an average of 70 to 80 criminals a year. But London alone had over 1,000 medical students entering universities annually. A single executed murderer could not be divided among dozens of students. Furthermore, in an era long before artificial refrigeration, a corpse decomposed within days during the summer months. A medical student needed access to fresh anatomical material week after week to study different physiological systems. The math was inescapable. The medical field required thousands of dead bodies every single year, but the government legally provided fewer than 100. The law had created a massive, lucrative vacuum. And in the shadowy alleys of London, Edinburgh, Dublin, and New York, ruthless men stepped forward to fill it. The popular image of a lone, half-drunken grave robber stumbling through a dark cemetery with a rusty shovel is almost entirely a myth. By 1810, body snatching was an organized, highly professionalized industry run by ruthless criminal syndicates. The most notorious was London's Borough Gang, a tight-knit crew that controlled the supply of corpses to Guy's Hospital, St. Thomas's, and St. Bartholomew's. Their operations were terrifyingly methodical. During the daytime, gang members sent female spotters, often dressed as grieving widows or modest maidens, to walk through local churchyards. These women scouted fresh burials, noted the exact placement of graves, checked for night watchmen, and observed whether the earth was soft or packed down. When night fell, the Resurrectionists moved in small teams. They carried custom-built tools designed for speed and silence. Wood-bladed spades minimized sound. Short lantern boxes with leather shutters allowed them to flash light for a fraction of a second without alerting nearby patrols. Instead of digging up the entire grave, they cleared dirt only at the head end. Once the coffin lid was exposed, they used a specialized iron crowbar, known as a pig's foot, to break the top section of the box. They slipped a rope loop around the corpse's neck, or under its shoulders, hoisted the body out into the mud, and immediately stripped off the clothing. The Resurrectionists knew the legal system inside and out. If they were caught carrying a dead body, they faced a minor fine or brief imprisonment. But if they were caught with a shroud, a shoe, or a lock of hair, they could be hanged for theft. The clothes were always thrown back into the grave before the dirt was repacked. Once the body was pulled out, they shoveled the earth back into the hole, smoothed the surface, and scattered debris over the site. A skilled crew could enter a cemetery, unearth a corpse, restore the grave to its original state, and leave within 20 minutes. The hall was packed into large wicker hampers, flour sacks, or wooden crates labeled as hardware, pickled pork, or dry goods. The financial rewards were staggering. An adult corpse sold for roughly £8 to £10. Children, referred to in trade jargon as smalls, were sold by the inch, typically fetching 6 pence per inch up to 3 feet. Teeth were knocked out with hammers and sold separately to dentists to craft expensive ivory tooth sets for wealthy clients. Long hair was shaved and sold to wig makers. A successful resurrectionist could earn more money in a single night than a skilled carpenter earned in 6 months. To protect their lucrative monopoly, gangs bribed church sextons, cemetery gravediggers, and city watchmen. If a rival gang attempted to dig on their territory, the Borough Gang would violently assault them or deliberately leave an open, desecrated grave exposed to the public, triggering a police crackdown that wiped out their competitors. Anatomy professors turned a blind eye to where the bodies came from. Cash was paid at the back doors of university dissection rooms, no questions asked. Sir Astley Cooper once boasted before Parliament, "The law doesn't prevent us from obtaining bodies. There is no person, let his station in life be what it may, whom I cannot obtain if I think proper." But as the trade grew bolder, ordinary citizens began to realize that the graves of their loved ones were being routinely emptied. A wave of paranoia swept through Western society, sparking a desperate arms race between grieving families and ruthless grave robbers. As public outrage reached a boiling point in the 1820s, an entire industry of anti-grave robbing security devices exploded onto the market. Families who could afford protection invested in mort safes, massive, heavy iron cages locked over graves with deep masonry anchors. These cages remained over the dead for 6 to 8 weeks, long enough for decomposition to render the body useless to anatomists before being removed and reused for another burial. Others built watchtowers inside churchyards, where armed men sat overnight with loaded muskets. In some towns, communities formed voluntary grave-watching societies, taking turns pulling night shifts in frozen cemeteries. Engineers patented double-walled coffins, iron-reinforced vaults, spring-loaded explosive devices buried in the soil, and coffin collars, iron rings bolted to the floor of a box that locked around a corpse's neck to prevent it from being pulled out by a rope. These security measures worked, but they created an unprecedented supply crisis. As cemeteries transformed into armed fortresses, the availability of fresh corpses plummeted. The price of anatomical material skyrocketed. Anatomy professors grew desperate, threatening to fail students who could not provide their own subjects for dissection. In Edinburgh, Scotland, the undisputed medical capital of the world, the supply shortage hit a critical breaking point in late 1827. Enter 2 Irish immigrants living in the slums of Tanner's Close, William Burke and William Hare. In November 1827, an elderly army pensioner named Donald died of natural causes while lodging at Hare's boarding house. Donald owed Hare £4 in unpaid rent. Furious about the financial loss, Hare discussed the matter with his friend Burke. They decided to recoup the debt from Donald's dead body. They pried open the coffin, filled it with heavy bark from a local tannery, nailed it shut, and carried the corpse in a sack to Surgeon Square. They sold the body to Dr. Robert Knox, one of Edinburgh's most famous and charismatic anatomy lecturers, for £7 and 10 shillings. Dr. Knox was thrilled. The body was exceptionally fresh, unmarred by disease or grave dirt. He paid the men handsomely and told his assistants to inform Burke and Hare that they would gladly welcome them back whenever they had more subjects to sell. As Burke and Hare walked away with a heavy pocket of cash, they reached a terrifying realization. Digging up graves was cold, muddy, dangerous work. Mortsafes made it nearly impossible. But creating a fresh corpse from a living person? That required no shovels, no churchyards, and no waiting. Over the next 10 months, Burke and Hare committed at least 16 brutal murders in Edinburgh. Their strategy was chillingly deliberate. They targeted the most vulnerable members of society: the lonely, the destitute, the elderly, street peddlers, and women struggling with alcoholism, people whose sudden disappearance would unlikely trigger a police investigation. They invited their victims to the lodging house, plied them with cheap whiskey until they were incapacitated, and then killed them using a specialized, silent technique that left no marks on the body. One killer would sit on the victim's chest, pinning their arms, while the other pinched the victim's nostrils shut and forced their jaw closed. The victim died of suffocation in minutes without breaking a single bone or leaving a bruise. This method was so unique that it entered the medical and legal dictionaries as a brand new verb: burking. Dr. Knox asked 0 questions. Every time Burke and Hare arrived at his back door with a heavy wooden tea chest, Knox paid them in cold cash, praised the pristine condition of the tissue, and instructed his assistants to submerge the body in preserving alcohol. Even when medical students recognized a well-known local street vendor named Mary Patterson lying dead on the dissection table, a woman seen alive in town just hours earlier, Dr. Knox dismissed their concerns, claiming she had bought the body from a relative. The murderous streak finally unraveled on Halloween night in 1828. Lodgers staying at the boarding house grew suspicious, searched the premises while Burke and Hare were away, and discovered the cold body of an elderly woman, Margaret Docherty, hidden under a pile of straw beneath a bed. The resulting trial rocked the British Empire to its core. To secure a conviction, the prosecution offered William Hare a deal: immunity from prosecution if he turned state's evidence and testified against his partner. Hare took the deal without hesitation. William Burke was convicted of murder and executed in January 1829 before a roaring, furious crowd of over 25,000 onlookers. In a moment of supreme historical irony, the judge ordered that Burke's body be subjected to the very fate that had driven his crimes. He was publicly dissected at the University of Edinburgh. Today, Burke's skeleton remains on permanent display at the Edinburgh University Medical School, and a small pocket notebook bound in his preserved leathered skin sits inside a museum case just streets away from Tanner's Close. Dr. Robert Knox escaped legal prosecution, claiming he had no knowledge that the bodies were murdered. But public wrath destroyed him. An angry mob burned an effigy of Knox outside his home, his medical classes collapsed, and he was driven out of Edinburgh in disgrace. 3 years later, in 1831, a copycat gang known as the London Burkers, John Bishop, Thomas Williams, and James May, were caught after murdering a 14-year-old Italian boy and attempting to sell his body to King's College Hospital. The British government was forced to confront a horrific truth. By outlawing legal access to dead bodies while demanding high surgical standards, they had created an economic system where human life was actively hunted for profit. If the government did not fix the supply of corpses legally, the murders would never stop. While the horrors of Burke and Hare dominated the headlines, the history of body snatching was filled with forgotten, deeply bizarre stories that highlighted the absurdity and tragedy of the era. One of the most extraordinary cases was that of Charles Byrne, known throughout 18th century Europe as the Irish Giant. Byrne stood 7 feet, 7 inches tall, a result of an undiagnosed pituitary tumor. In 1780s London, he was a famous celebrity, exhibiting himself to paying crowds. But as his health deteriorated from tuberculosis and alcoholism, Byrne realized he was being relentlessly stalked by anatomists. The most persistent was John Hunter, the father of modern scientific surgery. Hunter wanted Byrne's massive skeleton for his private medical museum and made no secret of his intentions. Terrified of being dissected, Byrne made a meticulous deathbed arrangement in 1783. He paid a group of trusted friends to seal his dead body in a heavy lead coffin, transport it to the coastal town of Margate, and sink it into the deepest waters of the English Channel. When Byrne died at age 22, his friends set off for the coast with the coffin. However, during a stop at an inn along the journey, Hunter's agents stepped in. Hunter had bribed a corrupt local undertaker with £500, equivalent to over $70,000 today, to swap Byrne's body with paving stones of identical weight while the grieving friends were drinking in the pub. The empty lead coffin was solemnly buried at sea. Meanwhile, Byrne's body was secretly rushed back to Hunter's London laboratory. Hunter immediately chopped the body up, boiled it in a massive iron cauldron to extract the bones, and assembled the giant skeleton. Despite Byrne's explicit dying wishes, his skeleton remained on public display in the Hunterian Museum for more than 230 years, only being removed from public view in 2023 following decades of ethical campaign efforts. As local graveyards became increasingly guarded, the resurrection trade expanded into international smuggling. Crates of corpses preserved in brine were regularly shipped across the Irish Sea from Dublin to Liverpool, labeled as salted beef or herrings. In North America, the trade was equally pervasive. Medical schools at Harvard, the University of Maryland, and the University of Pennsylvania maintained steady pipelines of body snatchers. In the United States, grave robbing was heavily rooted in racial and economic oppression. Resurrectionists systematically targeted African American burial grounds, Native American graves, and poor immigrant potters' fields, knowing that minority communities lacked the political power to force police intervention. In 1788, this dynamic exploded in the New York doctors' mob riot. A group of young boys playing near New York Hospital looked through an open window and saw a medical student waving a severed human arm at them. One of the boys ran home and told his father that the arm belonged to his recently deceased mother. The father dug up his mother's grave that afternoon and found it completely empty. Within hours, an angry crowd of 5,000 armed citizens stormed New York Hospital. They dragged equipment into the streets, destroyed anatomical collections, and forced doctors and medical students to flee for their lives into the city jail for protection. The local militia was called out, opening fire on the rioters and leaving 20 people dead in the streets. Yet, despite the horror, the crime, and the systemic corruption, a profound paradox remains at the heart of this dark history. What did this century of grave robbing actually achieve for humanity? The answer is as unpalatable as it is undeniable. The thousands of corpses pulled from dark churchyards completely revolutionized human healthcare. Before anatomical dissection became widespread, a surgeon attempting an amputation was essentially performing a crude, blind hack job. Patients routinely bled to death in seconds because surgeons did not know the exact depth or trajectory of major arteries. Through relentless dissection on stolen bodies, surgeons mapped the precise pathways of the circulatory and nervous systems. They invented arterial ligation, tying off individual blood vessels with thread during surgery, which saved hundreds of thousands of lives during the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War. Anatomists discovered how internal organs interacted, identified the mechanics of hernia formation, mapped tumor growth patterns, and standardized modern surgical techniques. Every modern surgical procedure, from a basic appendectomy to a complex heart bypass, traces its fundamental techniques directly back to the anatomical maps drawn on those cold, blood-stained wooden tables in the 1800s. The resurrection trade was built on sacrilege, theft, and murder, but it transformed surgery from a terrifying slaughterhouse gamble into a precise, life-saving science. The horror of the London Burkers in 1831 finally broke the political deadlock in Great Britain. In 1832, Parliament passed a landmark piece of legislation that altered medical history forever, the Anatomy Act of 1832. The Anatomy Act fundamentally reshaped the legal framework of death. First, it abolished the hated provision of the 1752 Murder Act that used executed criminals for dissection. Second, and most importantly, it made it legal for medical schools to claim the unclaimed bodies of individuals who died in public workhouses, poorhouse infirmaries, and charitable hospitals, provided no relative stepped forward within 48 hours to pay for a burial. Virtually overnight, the commercial market for stolen corpses collapsed because medical schools could now obtain hundreds of unclaimed bodies legally from state institutions for free. The monetary value of a corpse fell to zero. The resurrectionists vanished from the streets almost immediately. The spades were put away, the mort safes were disassembled, and the night watchman went home. However, the Anatomy Act left a dark social legacy of its own. It effectively criminalized poverty. In the eyes of the Victorian working class, dying poor in a state workhouse now carried the exact same post-mortem punishment that had once been reserved exclusively for murderers. The fear of the grave robber was simply replaced by a terrifying fear of the workhouse hospital. It took another century of social evolution, rising civil rights, and ethical reform to shift the medical system away from coercion and toward true consent. Throughout the mid-20th century, nations replaced the automatic collection of unclaimed bodies with voluntary anatomical donation programs. Today, the entire foundation of modern medical education relies on altruism. Every year, tens of thousands of individuals voluntarily donate their bodies to science, allowing future doctors to learn anatomy with total dignity, profound respect, and explicit legal consent. Think back to that cold, muddy churchyard in London in 1826, the boxwood spades quietly scraping through the dirt, the snapped coffin lid, the white shroud was left abandoned in the mud, and the cold, bare body stuffed into a canvas sack in the back of a bread cart. It is easy to look back at the Resurrectionists as mere monsters of a bygone era, dark villains from a gothic horror story. But the historical truth is far more complex, unsettling, and human. They were the dark, dirty engine of a scientific revolution. Every time a modern surgeon makes a clean incision without severing a critical nerve, every time a traumatic internal hemorrhage is quickly located and clamped shut, every time a child survives an emergency operation, we are benefiting from a body of medical knowledge that was pulled, struggling and cold, out of the dark earth of a desecrated grave. Modern medicine was born in the bright light of scientific enlightenment, but it grew up in the shadows of the graveyard.